Hi everyone, and welcome to Core Lecture 8. Today we'll be discussing strategies for summarizing. Before we begin, you'll need the following materials for the lecture assignment. You'll need one source that you could include in Project 2, and you'll need a document to write on. Now, remember that the source that you could include with Project 2, of course, it can be a scholarly article if you'd like, but also if you'd like to include something like a TED Talk or a newspaper article or a magazine article or a blog post or something of that nature, you can certainly do that as well. The purpose and goals for today's lecture are as follows. First, we'll define the term summary. Then we'll explore methods for composing summaries. And then throughout, we'll discuss the rhetorical implications of summarizing texts. All right, summary. So what is it? You'll recall that we have talked about borrowing from the works of others and why that's important. And we did so previously by talking about how we can include direct quotes. Now, there are other ways in which we can include the words and the works of others in our own original pieces. And writing a summary is one way to do that. Now, it's a common method for referencing other works, and really what you're doing with a summary is you are taking an entire text or oftentimes a much longer piece, and you are simplifying the argument of another. And in order to do so, based off of what kind of source you're working with, you're going to highlight key bits of information. Now, with academic works, which is what we're going to be working more closely with in projects 3 and 4, so the annotated bibliography and your civic engagement argument, if you're summarizing a source in one of those, you'll highlight the main argument, the methods in which the authors took to support and explore that argument, and the conclusions that they reached. Now, if you're summarizing a more popular source, so let's say like a magazine article or a blog post or something of that nature, of course, you'll highlight the main ideas and arguments, but oftentimes, like let's say if you were to read something from like the Huffington Post or the Blaze or something of that sort, where it's a little bit more popular, where it's not scholarly as we'll define and discuss throughout the semester, there aren't a lot of well-defined methods or conclusions reached. Oftentimes, what you're reading are analyses, observation, opinion-based pieces, and the authors won't take as much time to say, this is how I am exploring this topic. Oftentimes, they're not going to develop that method section or the conclusion in as great of detail. So if you're working with a source like that, of course, you want to discuss what the main idea, and there will still be an argument there. But instead of looking at the methods and conclusions explicitly, like you might with an academic piece or a scholarly piece, you look at the rhetorical strategies. So you could come back to logos, pathos, and ethos and discuss, okay, well, this is the argument that this online piece published by the New York Times, like this is the argument they're making, but rhetorically, this is how they're supporting their piece. Again, because they don't really have that method section or that conclusion section that most academic works have. You can still explore the rhetorical strategies to incorporate that into a summary. Now let's discuss things that we should keep in mind when writing a successful summary. It's important to first remember that a summary must be true to what the original author says, while also emphasizing those aspects of what the author says that interest you, the writer. So as you summarize a text, you want to keep a balance in mind. You want to make sure that you are emphasizing to your reader why they are reading that summary and how it relates to your original piece that they're engaging with. So you do want to make it clear to them, okay, this is this summary, this is what it talks about, and this is how it is ultimately relevant to what I am arguing or observing here. However, you also want to make sure that as you do that and as you're emphasizing its relevancy and important to your own work, that you are representing the author's original argument as they had intended. So you want to make sure that you're not misleading your readers or misrepresenting any of the information that you're summarizing from another's text. Now, one way that you can do that is you can put yourself in the shoes of others. Two types of shoes you'll want to put yourself in. First, your audience. So what information do they need to know in order to make sense of the summary you're providing them? But then you also want to think about the original author. Put yourself in their shoes to say, okay, what did they want to get across with this piece that I'm summarizing? What did they want emphasized? How can I represent their conclusions in a way that is ultimately true to their own work, but also will make sense to my readers? Now, by not doing that, that can hurt your ethos or your credibility as a writer, because either you might be in a position where your audience says, I have no idea why you introduced this. It doesn't make any sense. I don't understand how it's relevant. So did you really think why you put this in? So if you don't put yourself in your audience shoes, then they can wonder if you've really thought through each source you're incorporating. But if you speak too much to your audience and don't pay too much attention to how the source originally intended for the content and the information that you're borrowing to be understood, then it can make you look untrustworthy. It can make you look as if you are intentionally trying to mislead your readers and sort of muddy up the argument of another writer or the findings of another writer. So as you go through, make sure that you've got that balance of knowing exactly what your audience, anticipating what your audience will want to know in terms of why you're incorporating that summary, but also incorporating that summary in a way that makes sense to your readers, but also is true to the original author's intent. All right, so now we're going to discuss the components of a summary and exactly how we write one. So as long as we can keep in mind that balance that we just discussed, we can actually apply, again, composing a summary. So first, you want to begin with the main argument. So this is going to be the case regardless of if you're citing an academic article, something that was published on BuzzFeed or a TED Talk. Regardless, it's going to have some kind of central argument. So we begin with the main argument. In his article, Dr. Jones argues that social media sites like Facebook and Twitter should wed the strengths of algorithm-based detection and human judgment to avoid fake news from trending. So that's the overall argument of the article, of the TED Talk, of the book, whatever it is that, we're summarizing. You want to start off with whatever the overall overarching argument is. So after you have summed that up in a sentence or two, you then want to discuss the forms of support. So throughout the text, he draws from several sources to support his argument. More specifically, he relies on the theories of internet scholars like Cass Sunstein and Eli Pariser to unpack the idea that while algorithms are designed by humans, they often lack an ability to determine the validity of source material. He also examined several cases from the United States, England, Germany, and Egypt to determine how well algorithm-exclusive programs detected and eradicated fake news from users' feeds. So by going through there, we've said, okay, to support this argument that Dr. Jones is making, he is pulling from Sunstein and Pariser. Those are, the theories that he is using to sort of shape his argument. But wait, he further supports it not just from these theorists, but by also actually looking at specific cases in various countries. Now, the forms of support are going to differ from one source to the next. So, for example, let's say that you are writing on climate change. So if you read an academic article, chances are strong that you will have the author or authors of that article say, well, here's our experiment. Here's how we went about constructing it. So that would be a form of support. So you could say, okay, yes, they are pulling from these previous studies, but this is ultimately how they designed their own study to support this hypothesis. Whereas, let's say you are reading an issue, an article from like National Geographic, also on climate change. So they probably won't have this elaborate experiment as a form of support. Rather, they might say, oh, we spoke with this expert in the field, or we went and visited this site to have, firsthand experiences. So the forms of support, even if, within the same topic, they're going to change from one type of source to the next. But what's important is that you are telling your readers how exactly this source is supporting their argument and how they're exploring it. After we have carefully defined how the authors have supported or how they are supporting their argument through sort of, I guess, their methodology, if you will, we then want to identify the conclusions of the piece that we are summarizing. Now, remember that in academic pieces, conclusions are a bit easier to locate than they would be in more popular pieces. So, in an academic article or in a book, you might have a whole section or a chapter that is specifically titled conclusions. But oftentimes, if you're reading an article on from Time Magazine, or if you're watching a news segment, or if you are listening to a TED Talk or something along those lines, they often don't have explicit conclusion sections. And so if that's the case, you can always look at the ways in which they rhetorically try to support their argument based off of the information they've included. But when conclusions are available and when conclusions are more explicitly stated, it's preferable to include those if you can, or to discuss those if you can. So let's see what that might look like. So building off of our example that we've been developing over the past few slides, we might say something like in a conclusion section, after looking at several case studies from around the world, Dr. Jones concludes that when social media sites rely only on algorithms to determine the validity of news, fake news is more likely to appear in a user's trending feed. To better prevent fake news from reaching those online, he finds that social media sites should use algorithms for initial detection, but then require a human employee to evaluate the content and either make it available for consumption or remove it from the site's queue of stories. So we've said, okay, this is Dr. Jones's argument overall. This is how Dr. Jones supports and explores that argument. And these are the conclusions that Dr. Jones reached after making that argument and after supporting it and exploring it in the way I've just discussed. So, when we think about language for summarizing, we really want to use signal words or signal language. What these words do is not only do they let the reader know that you're transitioning from your own original text to someone else's words, but they also frame the source's material in a way that you as the writer would find appropriate. So let's say, as we're going through and we are summarizing different perspectives and sources for project two, maybe you want to identify that someone's making a claim, making an argument, if you will. So maybe you could say, this source argues, this source reminds us, this source suggests. And so what that says to me is the reader is to say, oh, I'm reading this as an argument in and of itself. Whereas the next two, expressing agreement and questioning or disagreeing, I know that the source that, if I'm the reader, then I know that the source that you as the writer are summarizing perhaps is in response to another source or another work. So you could say, Source A acknowledges source B's argument in that source A also says blah, blah, blah. Or if we look at it in questioning or disagreeing, we could say source A complicates source B's findings by suggesting the opposite. So we will look at synthesis in greater detail here in the coming weeks, but it's always important that as you are summarizing, you want to think, okay, this source that I've just summarized, how does it dialogue with the other sources and the other perspectives that I am summarizing for this work? Now, you can also include recommendation verbs as well. So you could say advocate, implores, calls for, urges. So if we go back to, our previous example, we could even say Dr. Jones urges that to better prevent fake news from reaching those online, or Dr. Jones advocates or implores, something along those lines. So when we are writing a summary, this is a way I think that we can really still remain true to what the author is saying, while also crafting the summary in such a way that it will make sense to our readers as to why we're including it. Because if I were to say, oh, I'm summarizing this source so I can express agreement, show how it agrees with another source that I've included. So if that's the case, you'll summarize it to effectively echo what the original author intended, but you can also say, hey, this source supports this source, or maybe you're introducing it to express disagreement. You could say this source questions this one. And so as the reader, I know that you intend to present these sources either in agreement with one another or if they are disagreeing with one another. So that's always something to keep in mind as you're composing. All right, so for the lecture assignment, what I would like you to do is select one source you are thinking about using in Project 2. Again, whatever form or mode that takes is entirely up to you. Again, it can be anything from an academic article to a TED Talk to a BuzzFeed article. Um, and then using the structure and language that we've discussed, I want you to compose a brief summary. So what's the main argument? What are the means of support, and what are the conclusions or the rhetorical tactics that we see being used? So this should be about 100 words. And so aim for about 100 words on your summary. And in general, this is typically around how long most summaries tend to be, anywhere from, I'll say, 100 to 300 words. And that is so you are giving yourself enough room to effectively summarize the content in its entirety without basically retyping what your source has said, without throwing a novel at your reader. So for the weekly homework, you'll want to include your core lecture 8 summary and assignment in your week 4 submission. And remember, your week 4 submission should include your summary and assignments for core lecture 7, 8, and 9, as well as a mini lecture of your choice. And all of that is due to Canvas by 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, February 3rd. Now, if you have any questions or if you'd like to chat about any of these concepts in greater detail, feel free to message me on Canvas. All right, everyone, until next time.